Good afternoon and welcome. I am Ann Peters from the Pulitzer Center. Thank you for joining us today in our efforts to bring greater context to the Russia-Ukraine war. As we wait for more folks to join us, please let us know in the chat where you're listening in from. I also wanted to give a shout out to our recently released annual report, where you'll find highlights from the past year of in-depth reporting from the Pulitzer Center and terrific photography from around the world, along with educational resources that we hope you'll explore further. As you listen to today's conversation, please know that you'll also find at pulitzercenter.org much more reporting on Russia and Ukraine. The Pulitzer Center has supported over the years dozens of reporting projects from the region, and today's conversation is only the tip of the iceberg of the depth of knowledge you can find there. You'll also find educational resources to further contextualize the current conflict, especially for teachers and students, but they're available to everyone online. After a moderated conversation with today's speakers, we're eager for your involvement from the audience in a robust Q&A. Please make sure to add your questions throughout our session today via the Q&A icon on your screen. Please note that all attendees are muted otherwise, and we will be recording this session to post it online so you can share it out further. One other note, please stay on a bit longer after our session ends to participate in a brief survey. And now I'd like to turn to our guest for today. Rebecca Hamilton is an associate professor of law at American University's Washington College of Law. She is an internationally recognized expert on atrocity prevention, with her scholarship drawing on her experience in the prosecution of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. She is a former Pulitzer Center supported journalist reporting from Sudan. And Rebecca is also the author of Fighting for Darfur, Public Action and the Struggle to Stop Genocide. Rachel Oswald is our foreign policy reporter for CQ Roll Call. She covers the intersection of Congress and foreign affairs. Her Pulitzer Center supported projects include the return of Cold War nuclear fears. In addition to her reporting in the United States, Rachel has reported from Russia, Japan, Austria, South Korea, Kazakhstan, and the Dominican Republic. Sarah Topol is writer-at-large for the New York Times Magazine. She has reported from more than 36 countries in the Middle East, former Soviet Union, Asia, and Africa. Fluent in Russian, Sarah reported with the support of the Pulitzer Center for her project, among other projects, Russia's Real Foreign Policy. I see that we're also joined by Dimiter Kenarov. Demeter has been supported by the Pulitzer Center with 4 stories from around the globe, including between 2014 and 2015 from Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. So welcome, everybody. I want to just start out by giving us a bit of grounding, since today marks 2 weeks since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And here today, we're seeking to better understand this war and its implications beyond the headlines. With the growing casualties inside Ukraine and growing displacement of individuals and massive refugee flows out of the country, often it's difficult to grasp the broader historical and regional context. Even before February 24th invasion of Russia, the conflict had been ongoing for more than 7 years, most recently since Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula and began backing secessionists in eastern Ukraine. So Ukraine officially declared itself an independent nation in 1991. We won't have time today to go into the entirety of regional history, but we'll do what we can to expand all of our knowledge base, asking and talking about how does this current situation compare with Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea? What is the role of NATO and individual state actors in the region? And what about Russia's posturing on nuclear arms or attacks on nuclear facilities and on civilians? Talking about terms that we may be hearing in the news, from humanitarian corridors to sanctions, no-fly zones, and military intervention. So Rachel, if I can start with you, we spoke earlier this week about some of those terms, especially in the US policy situation, and what those might be signaling in terms of across types of political spectrum. What might be some of the conversations that you've heard in your reporting from the US policy side in terms of one of the reasons or the rationales that Russia has been using in terms of NATO? If you could talk a little bit about what you're hearing from the US policy side and what some of the misconceptions or misunderstandings are with today's situation.
Sure. Thanks, Anne, and thanks for having me. I would say at the top that what has struck me as I've watched this story grow and grow and grow until where we are today is there are a lot of misconceptions, and I think it's important that we really address them, because in addition to a war, a military war, there really is an information war going on here that I think is just as consequential to Ukraine's ability to protect itself as a democracy as the humanitarian and security assistance we're trying to deliver. Vladimir Putin is trying to, within his own country in Russia, own the information landscape, and also to shape how other countries and their societies understand what's going on. So in the United States, we have seen in the last decade a lot of genuinely interesting reworking of the way Russia is perceived. And I don't need to get into all of it because we all lived through the Trump administration, and we saw how, particularly on the far right, many embrace Putin because of his machismo and his condemnations of LGBTQ rights and issues. But that's still continuing right now, particularly in images to portray Ukraine as weak and corrupt. You see it on Fox News programming, some of their most popular, late night programming. This gets talked up. The re-airing and circulation of Russian disinformation campaigns about Ukraine having biological weapons or being on the verge of becoming a nuclear weapons holder. And when those are aired, particularly the biological weapons thing, I've seen gaining some steam. Like that's the right propagating Russian disinformation campaigns. So like that's important to understand. But more broadly and deeper is this whole idea about what is this war about? Putin has said it's about not wanting Ukraine to become part of NATO. And at the heart of that, he has said that the West, Washington specifically, has broken a pledge that it would not expand NATO up to Russia. It wouldn't expand NATO to the east, and that is incorrect. But it gets talked about because there's not a kernel of truth, but there is something there. At the end of the Cold War, as Germany, West and East Germany, were pursuing reunification, there was a conversation between Secretary of State James Baker and Gorbachev about the future of NATO and Eastern Germany. And an agreement was worked out that, a reunified Germany could be part of NATO. But there wasn't anything really discussed beyond that in terms of like an actual formal agreement, because after that, the Soviet Union fell. And so the Baker-Gorbachev conversation was about that time and place. And since then, the Soviet Union is no longer. And there was even a formal agreement in 1997 between Russia and NATO, to work together in peace. So when Putin is saying these things that, we broke our promise, it's not true. And it was a conversation. There was never a formal treaty agreement. And for issues like this, treaties are really important. And I guess that's a good segue to get to another thing that I find irritating is when people throw out these words like allies and partners. It's fine to use allies in a general conversation sense, but when you're talking about Ukraine and Russia and NATO, those words are important because Ukraine is not technically an ally. We don't have a military agreement with them to protect them if they are attacked. They are considered a partner country. So we can cooperate with them, we can give them security assistance, but we are not allies. And so when people say that, I wonder, looking at who they are, and why they're using those words in that way. And so when you see people, particularly, and it's not just on the right, it's also on the left, that you're hearing people parse this issue of NATO and should NATO be expanding. It's a valid question, and I'll just say a couple things before wrapping up. NATO expands on the basis of unanimity. All of the countries in NATO have to agree to do so. So it had been widely discussed that Ukraine's chances of joining NATO were very, very limited before this war, because getting all the countries in agreement just wasn't going to happen, and also because there is a rule that you can't have border issues that are being contested, because NATO doesn't want member countries to bring in conflict issues into the alliance. So I think that's also important to understand. And then just this whole issue of sovereignty. If people are going to make an argument that Russia has a right to have a say in who becomes part of NATO, okay, that's an argument to make. But then take it further. What Russia is saying is they want a sphere of influence. They want to be able to say what another country's foreign policy should be. And since World War II, the international community has moved beyond that. And I'm sure Rebecca can speak it more eloquently than I have. But if you're saying that you think Russia's right to have a say in another sovereign country's foreign policy, then say you don't think we should have nation states that are democracies choose their own fate. Like, just take it forward. If that's the argument you're making, whether you're on the left or the right, just spell it out, rather than what is happening right now, where people are just saying, I don't think, I think, Putin has a point. And maybe Putin does have a point, but there's a lot that's not getting fleshed out there, that for somebody like me, it's really important that you just say what you really mean. All right, I'll leave it there.
Okay. Thanks, Rachel. And I know there's been a lot of, there'd be good conversation, I think, in the questions too, from our audience on those points. And again, you're looking at this in a lot of ways from a US policy perspective, and some of the issues that you're seeing or what you're hearing. And Sarah, I know that in terms of reporting that you've done previously, in terms of analyzing Russia's foreign policy, what you've seen over time, wanted to see if you could share some light on that. I also know you've been in the region in Ukraine recently, but perhaps we start with some of the ideas that you have regarding your work and research looking at Russia's foreign policy and how that dovetails with the situation today with Ukraine.
Thanks so much for having me and for organizing this great panel. I think a discussion about agreements that were and weren't made in the 90s and the 80s is a really important part of this current atmosphere that we're living in. I think that I think that to say, okay. Sorry, I think that the things, looking into the history of the Russian perspective on what's happening right now, it's hard to talk about it given that what's happening right now is should be said as just completely illegal and immoral, and it's an invasion of another country against international law. The perspective of where Russia would come from to make such a move is it's difficult to do right now. In this environment, I think that Russian perspective leading up to 2019, when I was reporting this topic, is an important one and has some context for seeing where maybe the Russian the Kremlin aligned foreign policy establishment's thinking was, but cannot necessarily explain what we're seeing Putin do right now. I think in order to see or to understand exactly what's happening now, I would suggest that people look at maybe Michael Zigger's work. He has an op-ed in the New York Times today. He wrote a great book called All the Kremlin's Men, about the inner court of Vladimir Putin. And I think that there's a huge debate right now about why Putin has acted the way that he is acting, whether that has to do with COVID isolation, whether that has to do with completely purging himself of any like elite factions that may or may not give him ideas that he plays off each other. And like what the Kremlin looks like right now, I can't speak to that. I can only speak to what people were saying up until to 2019. And so I think at the time, I mean, as Rachel pointed out, there was quite a bit of debate about the promises between the West and Russia about what was going to happen with NATO expansion, and I think for Ukraine, and I would be curious as to people's perspective on this, is, you know, what about the Budapest memorandum? What guarantees were given to Ukraine there? And I think all of this contested history is really fascinating. I will say that from the Russian perspective that I reported in 2019, the Russians were in the establishment were surprised to learn that Americans thought that Putin was like a mastermind genius who was stealing all elections and had a master global plan to take over the world and was effectively executing it in the far left in Europe, in the far right in America, everywhere in between, because Putin and Russia, if you visit Russia, which we all have, you'll see that the country is not an efficient place to be, and that Putin is a former KGB officer who is potentially using various tactical maneuvers in which sometimes he's successful and sometimes he's not successful, but very often in the past he had been successful. He was incredibly lucky, I think, to move into places where the US and utilizing the national interests of countries like Egypt and Turkey, who have, again, their own national interest, as we see Ukraine and the Baltic countries had their national interest, and using it in a way that benefited Russia. And I mean, one conversation I had that I found really illuminating was with a military analyst who brought up the word bardak, which means like mess or chaos, and to really understand like the Russian foreign policy system, it was a whole lot of bardak. It was just like trying stuff, making it work in one place, having it fail in another place. I mean, and some of this stuff is in some ways fairly laughable. If you look at some of the stuff that the Wagner Group has done, and not at all effective. And I think we're seeing that here. I mean, again, I wouldn't say that I know what was happening in the Kremlin, but it seems by all accounts that this has been a gross miscalculation on the part of the Kremlin, potentially acting on, I don't know, bad intelligence or insanity, or depending on which theory you subscribe by. But there's no way that this could be seen as a successful campaign executed by a mastermind. So that's, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I'm gonna jump over to Demeter for just a moment, because Demeter, I'm not sure how long we'll have a connection with you. I know you've been in transit, and just want to get a sense from you in terms of, if you can say where you are now, and then what I think in some ways would be the perspective of also when you were doing reporting in 2014 there in the country, in Ukraine, in Crimea, to take us back to those days as well. So tell us where you are now, and then let's return to 2014.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm right now in Ismail, which is the southwest Ukraine, sort of the tip of Ukraine, on the Danube River, in a region, sort of the southern Odessa region, called Bujak. And I'm currently actually in a dormitory of a university which has been converted into a refugee camp. So we're getting a lot of refugees today from Irpin and from Nikolaev, mostly women and children. It's you know, the conditions are pretty basic, but at least it's clean, and there are people bringing in all kinds of you know, clothes and cookery and stuff like that. So there is food, but outside it's very, very cold. It's probably -10°C right now, and it's snowing. So it's terrible news for the refugees who are in transit right now. It's really a bleak situation. But what can I say? I mean, 2014 was a completely different kind of war. It was, Crimea itself was not a, all the so-called little green men, Putin's soldiers were there, but unmarked Russian army. But generally, there were no active fights or any kind of military action. There were some kind of locally organized groups were sort of marauding around and beating people and stuff like that. But there was nothing of the sort that we see right now, which is a full-blown conventional war. And back then, it was a matter of trying to use the grudges of the post Soviet period that people were having, not only in Ukraine, of course. I mean, this kind of post sort of communist nostalgia can be seen everywhere almost. In Bulgaria for sure, which is a very interesting country. That's where I come from, and still there is a lot of pro-Russian sentiment there even today. But in all kinds of places of the former Soviet bloc, and Putin was exploring this sort of sentiment, this sort of nostalgia, the fact that the 90s were seen as a complete economic disaster, and the economic gap between the rich and the poor became so terribly big, because during socialism, basically everybody was equally poor, so to speak. And I think he was relying to a certain extent. I mean, he was for sure relying on this during 2014, during the Crimea crisis, and that's how he riled up a lot of the ethnic Russian speakers in Ukraine, specifically in Crimea, but also in the East, to support his policies. So really, it was sort of inciting rebellions from within Ukraine, with the help, of course, of the GRU, the secret services of Russia, and the Russian army. But they were sort of in the background. I think that in this, at the beginning of this war, Putin was probably relying on something similar. That suddenly the Russian army would come in, and there will be all these sort of local rebellions and people taking over various kinds of administrative buildings and so on, and sort of helping the Russian army. But the miscalculation was, of course, that since 2014, Ukraine has definitely come together as a nation. As a lot of people have said, that Ukrainians and outside observers, that Putin more or less created the Ukrainian nation, which was very fragmented before that. So the kind of opposition that he faces right now is probably something that he didn't quite expect. And of course, the Russian army, which we thought was also so modernized and so on, seems a little bit like an army of the Tsar serfs sometimes. They do have some weapons, but from what we've seen so far, there is a lot of the weak points have been exposed as well. And certainly he's losing on many fronts. Russia's economy is in free fall. The Russian army is not making many advances. Perhaps the kind of end game that he was seeking initially in Ukraine was to split Ukraine into two parts, really to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea coast, and render Ukraine economically marginal, sort of a run state of, let's say, Western Ukraine around the fifth. Maybe this is still the plan. Who knows what's in his head? But definitely there is no winner in this war, which has brought terrible suffering on the Ukrainian people, and has backfired on Russia so badly. But anyway, it's a situation that we've all been following. It's like living in a nightmare. I'd never have thought that we'd come to this stage of what's happening right now. And really, what I see Putin doing is a kind of revanchism. maybe something that the Germans were doing after the First World War to a certain extent. That he sees himself, at least that's my feeling, that it's kind of a legacy that he wants to leave behind, that he wants to make Russia great again, and to have his own sphere of influence, and maybe not to take over Eastern Europe the way Eastern Europe belonged to the Soviet Union sphere of influence directly, but to be considered a major player, to be respected, so to speak, and so on, whatever that means. But yeah, I think he badly miscalculated, and what's really, of course, scary right now is that it's a man with nuclear weapons. I think we all realize that, and we have to be very careful. Yeah.
Thank you, Demeter. And I know some of those points, we want you to stay safe, and other folks, in terms of, this massive flow of refugees that you were talking about. And I think UN High Commissioner for Refugees has estimated in these 2 weeks, more than 2 million individuals have evacuated the country, and most to Poland. And that's not even taking into account displaced individuals who are within the country, who are in Odessa, and in other regions. And I know in the chat there have been a lot of questions, again, these terms, and we'll get to some of the idea about nuclear saber rattling, which I know Rachel has been thinking on, and also the questions of allies and partners. What does that mean? And what will that mean for Ukraine now and going forward? Thinking about, too, turning to you, Beck, in terms of, the enforcement of international law. What is going on here? Even as Demeter pointed out, maybe on the ground, the Russian military is not making those advancements and not seeing it, but that bombardment of civilians that unfortunately we see on the nightly news and hear reporting and see the photographs. Talk to us about that. People have asked, well, is this genocide? Is this ethnic cleansing? Tell us more about, from the international law perspective, what you can help us with.
So one of the things in this moment is that we have total clarity that this is an absolute and unequivocal violation of one of the core tenets of our international legal system, which is specifically Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, to which all nations agree that we are not supposed to be using the threat or use of force on the territory of a sovereign state, of another sovereign state. Now, the rub is that notwithstanding that total clarity on what the law is and that this is a violation of it, who enforces it, as you asked? And the key political body that we have for that is the UN Security Council. And of course, on the UN Security Council, the 5 permanent members each have veto power, which means that Russia has veto power in this situation. And so your enforcement mechanism that you would turn to in the first instance doesn't work in this scenario. Now, what's been really interesting to me over the past week is we saw that play out in devastating form in real time when Ukraine called for an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council. It was presided over by the Russian Federation at that time. And it was very clear that was unfolding right as play was hit on the pre-recorded announcement by Putin that he was launching this so-called special military operation in Ukraine. And so it really, I think, put into stark relief for everybody the impotence of the UN Security Council in that moment. But subsequently, what we saw was a move under what's called a Uniting for Peace resolution that allowed the UN General Assembly, so that's everyone in the UN, not just the states that are on the UN Security Council, to sort of do a run around the fact that the UN Security Council itself was paralyzed. And so you had this resolution out of the UN General Assembly in which it was 141 nations with only 5 opposing that condemned this invasion by Russia and this act of aggression. So that still doesn't, that is a sign, I think, of real unity in the international community. one of the things that is frustrating for a lot of other people all around the world who are facing violations of their territory and their political independence is we haven't seen that kind of swift uniformity and condemnation. And I think of this particularly in relation to Sudan and connections to that community, that they're watching this unfold and seeing how quickly the world can come together in some senses. But that is just the political signal. And the question is, if Putin, as he seems to be, ignores that strong political signal from the world, then what next? And that's when we start to, all these questions are coming up about sanctioning. We've seen, again, swift movement on that. But when you run out of your diplomatic tools, your economic tools, then the question comes to your military tools. So that's all the stuff that's happening in real time. And then we've got what role can after the fact accountability perhaps have in terms of deterring the calculations of actors in real time. And so you have seen the International Criminal Court start to move forward with its investigation of war crimes in Ukraine. It feels difficult to imagine deterrence of Putin in this moment, but maybe the signal to lower level or frontline soldiers in particular, who I think were sold on this idea that they would be sort of welcomed in Ukraine. And as Demeter said, there's this sort of hope that maybe it would turn out like it did in Crimea, for example, or even what they were seeing in Eastern Ukraine, and is simply not the case. It's very clear that those expectations were not met. And so, additionally, knowing that there could be prosecutions for war crimes may have some deterrent value.
And in terms of the steps, and Rachel, you talked about sanctions. People want to know, what about a no-fly zone? And I will open this to anyone in terms of jumping in to discuss either the sanctions aspect, both whether it's US, NATO, or others, as well as this questioning over what can be done to stop the bombing now, especially of civilians. So I'll open that up to anyone who wants to jump in on that, either of those 2 points.
I can talk a little bit about no-fly zone, and then maybe pass the baton to somebody else. It was interesting to me. There was this recent poll, and I forget the group that did the poll, but it revealed a surprisingly high number of Americans and Europeans supporting a no-fly zone, like over 40%, with lower percentages saying they don't support it, and the majority undecided. And that to me was really interesting because, especially in America, there's this sense that journalists have that Americans are war weary. After 2 decades of unsuccessful military interventions in the Middle East, Americans are we just don't think we should be going and getting ourselves involved in things that aren't core U.S. national interests. So that there was this relatively high level of support to me was interesting, but also the polling question did not do the key thing and say, do you support a no-fly zone, which would put the United States into direct military conflict with Russia? And that's key. That there's such relatively high support for a military action that Vladimir Putin has said we will see as, because he's not calling Ukraine a war, he says we'll see you being an active military participant in this operation. So I think, again, that speaks to this idea that there's a lot that people don't understand about what's happening in Ukraine and that's why I think it's so important that we really drill down on these things. Like, a no-fly zone means that we are basically saying no airplanes and no missiles from a certain country can come into this covered airspace, and we will use military means to destroy those missiles and those planes. So if Russia is flying fighter planes into Ukraine to carry out attacks, NATO, and in this case, more than likely the United States, would use its Air Force and its capabilities to destroy those military planes and possibly the bases from which they're launching. We have used no-fly zones before in the past. Libya, Iraq after the Gulf War, and Bosnia. But in those cases, those were against foreign governments that did not have an air force that could contest us. We weren't really putting, I'm not going to say we weren't putting skin in the game, but we knew the risks of our fighter planes being shot down was minimal. And that's why we did it. That's not the case at all with Russia. There's a probability that if we took this action, it would mean, full-scale war with Russia, which again is a nuclear weapon country. And it's something that we never did during the Cold War. Even as bad as things were, we didn't take that step because our military planners were so convinced of the escalatory inherent nature of that.
And just to piggyback on that, in terms of when Vladimir Putin has talked about the nuclear, for lack of a better word, option, or some of the saber rattling, in any conversations you have had recently when that came up with experts, analysts for the region, what was the response on that? How accurate, short of if there was a direct conflict via a no-fly zone? To that.
I think there's two parts to that. There's what we can see happening on the ground. The United States military and even our private satellites keep a close eye on Russia's nuclear forces, their status, their alert level, and the people who track that, both people in our national security, intelligence, military community, and people who are in the private sector using satellite resources, say that they are not seeing on the ground actions that would suggest, the mating of warheads with delivery mechanisms. They're not seeing like Vladimir Putin did say that he had ordered an enhanced combat role for nuclear forces. If that might be true, but there were not, at least that I have seen and heard, corresponding actions at the ground level to discuss that there was a high alert. So right now it looks like nuclear saber rattling. So that's one part of it. But then the second part of it is, well, even if he's not doing it yet, could he give the order, and what's the probability of that? And that one is more difficult. I generally, agree with people who say, let's not psychoanalyze somebody from like our armchair. We're not psychologists. We shouldn't do that. But it's really important to know the mental state of this person. Like it really is. So I understand why everybody is frantically trying to discern his intentions. Putin seems to have behaved irrationally in so many ways in creating this conflict and then invading Ukraine and launching an unprovoked war because of what he believed. So that's irrational. Many people believe that to order a nuclear first attack when you are not being attacked with nuclear weapons is irrational because it's so self-defeating. And so the question then is this man who's acting irrational in these other areas, is he still rational about what his decision to order a nuclear weapons use would gain him? And I think that's very important. And I don't know the answer. I mean, nuclear weapons don't really have a military value, okay? Their value is in killing lots of people and telling the world you're prepared to kill lots of people. So if he did do that, I mean, he's already a pariah, but he would condemn his entire country to pariahhood. What's the sense in that? And I don't know. I would say that President Joe Biden, I think, has been correctly very sober and cautious in not getting into any kind of a reciprocal nuclear saber rattling, pausing a pre-planned regular test launch of an ICBM so that there could be no chance of miscalculation, doing everything he can to convey the sense that the United States is secure in its own military capabilities, and we are not going to follow Putin down this irresponsible nuclear saber rattling rhetoric, because there is a chance for miscalculation there. And so I think that that's being done well.
Thank you. I know we're at about 20 minutes or so to go, and we've already gotten questions from our audience, a pretty broad range of them. And a few of them dovetail, I think, both for Sarah and Demeter. In part, we're switching gears a bit now to back to some more historical components. One question from one of our audience members has to do with, is Putin looking in terms of Kyiv as the heart of Russia valid? A historical argument, and I think there's touched upon the greater empire connection time. And I know, Sarah, you spent weeks in the region for your reporting for Harper's Magazine, looking at national identity in Ukraine, broadly speaking, and Demeter as well, you've been in Ukraine. And so thinking about this juxtaposition of Greater Russia, Mother Russia, and the national identities within Ukraine that I think for some of our audience may or may not be aware of, the historical overlay with identities, Ukrainian identity, Russian identity within the region. If either of you would like to touch on that first, and then we can go to the other.
I think Sarah's the bigger expert on this, so I think she should go first.
I don't know if that's really the case, but I will give it my best. So I think one thing that that people need to keep in mind about Ukraine and Ukrainian history, and generally Russian history and post-Soviet history, is that all of it is contested, and there has been no reconciliation commission similar to the kind we've seen in other places to really look into what is, like, capital T true and what is just a version of our history that we tell ourselves. And I think Ukraine is a very fascinating place to explore these differing opinions in a place where it's actually had a relative amount of freedom to express these differing opinions about history, unlike Russia, where we see places like Memorial recently being closed, which is a long-standing center that was documenting the brutality of the Soviet regime, and which was recently closed by Putin's regime, or by the Kremlin. And so in Ukraine, you had a really distinct, as I think Demeter said really well, kind of gripes, post-Soviet gripes, grappling with what identity was and wasn't in a country that had never before existed in these borders, which it found itself with post 1991. And for my project for the Pulitzer Center, I traveled from the very west of Ukraine to the very east of Ukraine and looked at how Ukrainians saw themselves. One thing that I think people maybe aren't necessarily as aware of about the USSR was that ethnicity was written into your passport. So you had a Russian ethnicity, Ukrainian ethnicity, Jewish ethnicity, and you had different people speaking different languages, all kind of Sovietized, Russified to speak Russian, but who would maybe sometimes speak, and in many cases speak their ethnic language at home with their children, with their grandparents, and hold these kind of memories of their ethnic groups kind of secret or outside of like school and state structure. And these identities never had really a chance to express themselves and solidify into a more coherent national melting pot identity, maybe similar to what Americans understand our country as being. Ukraine was grappling and trying to accommodate all of these different ideas of what it meant to be Ukrainian within these borders when I was working on my project in 2015. And certainly the invasion of Crimea and the annexation of Crimea and the Russian-backed separatists in the east of the country were a big part, I think, of what moved this identity from this fragmented state, as Demeter mentioned, to what we're seeing now, which is a very fascinating, I think, creation of an identity that had previously been really, in some ways, problematic to people in the population. I mean, now when I see on TV that people are chanting, you know, "Glory to Ukraine, glory to our heroes," that slogan, and it has a contested history, a difficult history for Ukrainians, for some in the East, because it comes from a kind of like a nationalist group that had initially come into existence as kind of a white power movement that then became a very that then softened its stance over time and tried to create Ukrainian statehood, and to see everybody, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, Zelensky, a Russian-speaking Jew who's Ukrainian, you know, using these national identities and mythologies is really thanks in some large part to Vladimir Putin, who was trying to destroy this sense of community. And I think those things are a really fascinating and dynamic and changing aspect of all of this post-Soviet identity creation. That answers some of that question.
Thank you. Demeter, would you like to add to that?
Oh, I think Sarah explained it really, really well. And one thing that could be added here maybe is that, you know, that sort of, you know, rise of nationalisms was actually a late Soviet phenomenon. Oftentimes power was given to various strongmen in various republics in the late 70s, in the 80s, so that they could keep on the wraps, you know, to keep control of their own areas. You know, basically, you could talk about Central Asia or other places, but those nationalisms in other periods of Soviet history were violently suppressed, and then in others they were sort of supported. In Ukraine, it's a difficult thing, you know. Even after 2014, I spoke to a lot of people who felt very strongly one way or another. There was definitely a lot of pro-Ukrainian sort of pro-West sentiment, but there was definitely, especially if one goes around Russian-speaking places in the South or in the East, where there is a lot of memory of sort of the Soviet Union, and Russian is sort of the lingua franca, and definitely, I think the Western media oftentimes overplays the card a little bit of Ukrainian unity. Maybe not now during the war, where people have really sort of, a lot of them have stood against Putin. But really there are voices. If one starts traveling around the country, start talking to people, which in one way or another would be interpreted as pro-Russian or supportive of Russian policies in certain ways. For example, here in the area that I'm in, the Bujak region, which is part of the, as I said, the Odessa region, it is the most multi-ethnic region of Ukraine. It is actually ethnic Ukrainians are only about 40% of the population. 20% are Bulgarians who came here in the early 19th century, when Russia took over these lands and ethnically cleansed the local Tatars and the local Muslim populations, who were part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and invited Christian populations from the Ottoman Empire to settle this land. So Bulgarians, as Orthodox Christians, came here in the early 19th century. There are also Moldovans or Romanians who speak Romanian language. They're about 20%, and the Russians are about 20 something as well. So in a sense, it is kind of a melting pot. Although each and every village really here is sort of mono-ethnic. So there are Bulgarian villages next to Moldovan villages, next to Gagauz. The Gagauz basically are Turkic-speaking Christians. So this region of Ukraine, which nobody talks about, is extremely interesting. But what the sense that, and I've traveled around this region before. Now it's still early for me to say what the sentiment is, but there was definitely a lot of pro-Russian sentiment, a lot of people who are watching a lot of Russian propaganda, a lot of Russian TV here, and so this region could turn potentially into another Crimea because it's very isolated geographically. It's connected to Odessa only by 2 bridges. It's again, multi-ethnic, where ethnic Ukrainians are a minority, and there is this sort of historical pro-Russian kind of sentiment here. So Ukraine is a very diverse country, as Sarah was pointing out, and we're just about to see, how the sort of the national issue plays out during the war. Most probably, my feeling is that this will unite Ukrainians even more. There's already a backlash against even the Russian language as such by certain Russian speakers who sort of give up their Russian language in order to speak Ukrainian and to show their support of Ukraine, their belonging to a sort of a Ukrainian identity. So things are dynamic, and we'll see where all this leads.
Thank you both. I know we only have a few minutes left. And there are a lot more questions in the Q&A, and really appreciate folks thinking about these points. We'll make sure to have a wrap up from each of you or some takeaways to share. I know that there are a couple of questions back to you, Beck, though, before we go with that wrap up. In terms of why Russia cannot be kicked off the UN Security Council, and the likelihood of war crimes prosecution. Tell us about that.
Right. So on
2 minutes or less.
Yeah. Okay. So on the Security Council, it is set in the UN Charter. It was a post-World War II agreement, and the Soviet Union got the seat. And then in 1991, it was never disputed that Russia could take on that seat. And so while there perhaps wasn't all the process that you might want to see around that, and this was something that the Ukrainian representative raised at the Security Council, nonetheless, it's a long time since 1991. Russia has had the seat since then, and so that is not going to change. In terms of war crimes prosecutions, this is where the fact that Ukraine has said to the International Criminal Court, we're granting you jurisdiction over crimes taking place on our territory through the present day, does mean that there is the possibility of accountability for the war crimes that are happening. And particularly interesting, I think, is seeing the way that social media has had a lot of negative connotations in this context because of the role of disinformation and misinformation. But at the same time, it is allowing Ukrainian citizens to do some documentation of the crimes that they're seeing that will in the future be used by the International Court in these prosecutions. Actually getting hold of high-level Russian leaders to hold them responsible is back to our international law enforcement problem. But we've seen historical precedent for this, and certainly, back in the day, no one thought that Milosevic would ever actually appear before a tribunal, and eventually it happened.
Yeah, and in terms of holding accountable, getting the evidence, one question came to mind, and this we could maybe share out afterwards, or we can put in the chat. But if one of our audience members is wondering whether each of you could speak to 2 or 3 or even one online tool or database for that you follow in following what's going on with the Russia-Ukraine war, a database and experts, someone that you are following and listening in on, if you could share that with the audience, because I think people are just wanting to know more and where they can get some solid information. Back to you. I mean, to start with you.
I was going to plug, there's an app called Eyewitness to Atrocity that the International Bar Association runs for anyone that is looking to do documentation. That would be one place to start.
Rachel, I know you have a laundry list of experts that you follow, and you want to share one or two.
You know, there's a list of experts that I follow on Twitter, and they have been putting out some very useful Twitter thread analyses of things on the nuclear posturing front, Putin's incentives, disincentives for nuclear use, as well as sanctions and all of the nuance in that. And I can put those in the chat, some of those experts, yeah.
Okay. Sarah?
I think too, I mean, it's obviously it's hard now because they've closed all of the Russian opposition media. So it's difficult, but there are some resources, I think, to see more of the Russian or the perspective that the Kremlin is maybe allowing slightly oppositional, which I think is the Carnegie Moscow Center. They do political analysis by people who are not maybe directly linked to the Kremlin, but in some ways, like the fact that they exist in general is like nowadays in Russia, like their perspective is somewhat within the bounds of what is like legally allowed. So I would follow them. No knocking the experts there, but just the fact that it exists says one thing or another. And I think, you know, that the Russian opposition TV, I think or free independent TV, not opposition, I should say, will in some cases, I imagine, resurrect itself in some form based on like from some other place, or there are places like Medusa, which is, I believe, outside of Russia for the most part, but I can't speak for sure, that I would look at to see a kind of Russian perspective, a more unbiased and independent Russian perspective than state media. But I do also think that it is interesting to follow Russian media to see what the conversation looks like from that perspective, knowing, of course, that what you're seeing is state media, which I think you see on Twitter, the banner that it is state media. Yeah.
Demeter, is there? Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say also there are very brave Ukrainian journalists who are covering the conflict from Ukraine, and that, of course, the key of, I think, independent is now the new. That's another resource that I think would really benefit readers. Sorry.
Yeah. No, thank you, Sarah. Demeter, is there one tool or place that you go to?
I don't think there is one tool. As I like Sarah, I also tend to follow various kinds of sources. I do follow Russian TV, state TV as well, like Россия 24, or like, you know, the first channel, because you do get a sense, you know, of, you know, just by looking at the propaganda and how the spin is going, you get a pretty good sense of what state policy would be or what would follow from then on. So that's important, I think, for experts to follow. I think, you know, definitely Kiev Independent. Lots of people on Twitter these days are, you know, writing 50-part threads. You know, everybody's a little bit of an expert. Let me tell you what Putin is thinking. Let me tell you, you know, why this is important. Some of them have been very helpful, others not that much. But really, it's a variety of sources that you have to go through and see for yourself. Telegram is you know, the Telegram channels are interesting if you want to see what happens minute by minute. But they're also full of misinformation oftentimes and fake videos and so on. So I'd be very careful, you know, and not trust the information there, or it is verified.
Yeah, verification for sure. Thank you. So we are really at the top of the hour. So this has flown by fast. I will keep us for maybe a few more moments. If any of you just want to have one takeaway to share with our audience, how this Ukraine-Russia war, what it means for other international conversations. We talked about the refugee flows, and Beck, you talked about also the impact on other conflicts. So just want to turn, Beck, maybe I'll start with you again. Just one takeaway, and then I'll wrap us and thank you for your time.
Just that this shows a huge problem for the functioning of our international legal order right now. And I'm hopeful, you know, if I can say anything hopeful, that in moments of crisis, we can find new ways to act as an international community. But it is it's a difficult time to be an international lawyer.
Demeter, Demeter, then Rachel, then Sarah, and then I'll take us home.
Well, I think that this is definitely a watershed here. The way 89 was, 45, thanks, years like that. I don't think the world is, we see it. If it's the world as we've known it would be the same, whether in terms of international law, in terms of, economic relations, it's going to be different. But to me, an important part really here is also not to direct the hate against all Russians, as this has been happening a lot. They're very brave Russians from inside Russia who've been fighting that regime for years, who are going to prison. It's a really difficult job for a lot of them. And yes, there are a lot of people supporting Putin because of the propaganda. But let's not turn this into the hatred of an entire ethnic group, because I think we've seen that before. And whether it comes from one direction or another, it leads to terrible consequences.
I would just echo of what has been already said about it being a watershed. This is a watershed, and I have a sinking feeling it's still the opening act for what is to come in the coming years and decades with China. How the West under US leadership is able to keep countries united in this plan of using economic isolation to punish Russia over the long term, I think will send a message to China over whether it could possibly, think it could seize Taiwan, and it could bear the costs of that. The Biden administration has said that it sees Russia as the most important short-term national security challenge for the United States, short, medium term, but that China is the long-term kind of holistic national security challenge for the country for the 21st century. And I think what happens here will absolutely have bearing on decisions made by countries when it comes to China and what worked and what didn't work.
I think that what's happening, to have a takeaway from it right now, is difficult to think what we will see in the future. I am also afraid that this is just the beginning. I do think it's important to keep in mind when we talk about the effects of this on global politics that there are countries that that are not top of mind to us. The world is made up of a lot of countries: Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean. Obviously, I could name the whole globe. But and when we Western media talk about the reaction of the global community, and we need to think about this kind of world in a holistic sense. And I think one of the things that we often got wrong about Russia was about the interests of countries like Turkey or Egypt, Saudi Arabia, whatever, using their own national interests in places or reacting to things in their own national interest in places where our perception of what their national interest is differs from their perception of national interest. And so I am interested in looking at the reaction of countries that maybe are not top of mind to us right now in a unified front, and how they will be navigating this bizarre new world that we're seeing the opening salvos of. And that's what I'm kind of curious about moving forward. Yeah, thank you. This has been great.
Can I just leave one final thing? Just that we cannot, this shows for me how we cannot, this notion that we can kind of close our borders and isolate ourselves and keep ourselves safe doesn't work. It's never worked. It can't work in the moment. And I think it matters to look at the human rights situation for people in other countries. And if we look at Russia from 2012 in particular onwards, the closing down of civil society, the attacks on human rights defenders, all of that is what enables a Putin to take this move when you've totally shut down dissent. And so very much echoing the point that Demeter made about the support for Russian civil society and what it's trying to do and how that enables all of us. And that goes not just for Russia, but in the many, many countries around the world where people are trying to provide a voice for the lived experiences of people on the ground.
Well, thank you so much. I know there's a lot that we weren't able to cover, but I really appreciate your time, Beck and Demeter, Rachel and Sarah, for sharing your thoughts with us today, and a lot more to take under consideration and keep following. So thank you, all of you, for your time and your knowledge. Thanks also to my Pulitzer Center colleagues who helped us coordinate today's panel, especially to Holly Rosewood, our producer for this session. And we appreciate all of you in our audience today, knowing that if you are able to support the Pulitzer Center as a nonprofit journalism organization, we hope you will become a Pulitzer Center champion. Please stay with us a bit longer to take a brief survey after we officially close. We're eager to hear from you. And remember that we'll be posting our conversation online so you can share it out with other folks. Thank you again, and goodbye for now.